Section 5.3 is adding and subtracting unlike fractions. I can add and subtract unlike fractions. That's our learning target and what we're shooting for here. To add or subtract fractions with different denominators, the first thing we have to do is find the least common denominator of the fractions. And once we have that common denominator, we can rewrite our fractions so that they're equivalent with that same denominator. And then once we have that common denominator, both of our fractions with the same denominator, we can go ahead and simplify adding or subtracting just like we did in section 5.2. So in A here, we want to add these. So between 12 and 3, my least common denominator, here I have a 2 and a 2 and a 3, and 3 is just 3. So my common denominator is my least common multiple, which means I multiply all of my columns together. And here I get 12. 12 is the smallest number I can multiply my denominators by a number to get to. So I can take 12 times 1. It just stays at 12. 5 times 1. I can take to get to 12, 3 times 4. They're the 2's that I'm missing here. So 2 times 2 times 3 is how I get to 12. If I change my denominator, I have to change my numerator. So again, once we have that common denominator, I make both of my denominators 12, and I figure out how did I get to that. Well, if I started at 3, I have to multiply by 4 to get to 12. If I change my denominator, I have to change my numerator. Now that I have the same denominators, I can keep that denominator and perform the operations on my numerators. So 5 plus 4. This is going to give me 9 over 12. I'm going to simplify here because they both have a 3 that I can divide out, which means I'm going to get 3 over 4. So 5/12 plus 1/3 gives me 3/4. In B, we have subtraction, so I'm going to change it to adding the opposite. So I really have negative 5/6 plus negative 7/9. Now, between 6 and 9, the smallest number they can both multiply to, we can also list out our multiples here. And we see that 18 is the smallest number they both multiply to. So whether you use your prime factorization and your factors, or you list out your multiples, either way, we can get to that least common multiple, which is our common denominator. So 6 times 3, 1, 2, 3, is how I got to 18. If I change my denominator, I have to change my numerator the same way. So I get negative 15. In my second fraction, my denominator was a 9, and to get to 18, I have to multiply by 2. 9 times 2 is how I got to 18. If I change my denominator, I also have to change my numerator. Now that I have that common denominator, I can keep my denominator and perform the operations on my numerator. So negative 15 plus negative 14. It's going to give me negative 29 over 18. Now, we don't want to leave this as an improper fraction. My numerator is bigger than my denominator. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide. 18 goes into 29 once. And we don't worry about our sign here. Remember, that's kind of like a label. We'll add that later. And 11 is my remainder. So now we have negative 1 and 11 over 18. And it's over 18 because that is my divisor there. It's what my denominator was to start with, so it stays that way. So remember, it's negative whole number that we got when we divided, and then remainder over denominator. In number 1, 3 and 4 are relatively prime, which means they have no common factors. So I can get my common denominator by multiplying them together, which gives me 12. Now I have to change both denominators to be 12. 3 times 4 is how I get to 12. Since I changed my 3 by multiplying by 4, I have to change my numerator the same way. 4 times 3 is how I get to 12. If I change my denominator, I have to change my numerator the same way. So now I have negative 8 twelfths plus 3 twelfths. Now that my denominators are the same, I can combine them into one fraction by performing the operation on my numerators and keeping my denominator. Negative 8 plus 3, different signs. We subtract and give the sign of the bigger number, and I get negative 5 twelfths. That does not simplify. They are relatively prime. On 2, we have subtraction, so I'm going to change to adding the opposite. So I really have 3/10 plus negative 4 over 5. Here, 5 is a factor of 10, which means that 10 is our least common denominator. It's the smallest number they both multiply to. 10 times 1 is 10, so we keep it as 3 over 10. To go from 5 to 10, though, we have to multiply by 2. If I change my denominator, I also change my numerator. So I have negative 8 over 10 there. Now that we have that common denominator, we go ahead and keep our denominator, perform our operations on our numerator. Different signs here, so we subtract to give the sign of the bigger number. And we can reduce here by dividing both of them by a common 5. So we're going to get negative 1 over 2, or negative half. Again, we always want to reduce if we can. So since 5 and 10 are both divisible by 5, we took out that common factor. We write our fractions in lowest terms. For 3, again, here I have subtraction, so I change to adding the opposite. So I really have negative 4/15 plus negative 9/10. Between 15 and 10, so multiples of 15, here we have a common one. So 30 is going to be our common denominator. 15 times 2 is how I get to 30. I have to change my numerator then the same way. If I change my denominator by multiplying by 2, I also have to change my numerator. My denominator, 10 times 3, was how I got to 30. So if I change my denominator, I also have to change my numerator, and I get negative 27 here. Now, we have common denominators, so I can keep my denominator, perform the operation on my numerator. So I'm going to take negative 8 plus negative 27. Same sign, so I add them up and keep it over my denominator. Here I'm going to reduce if I can. 35 and 30 are both divisible by 5. So I end up with negative 7 over 6. And my numerator is bigger than my denominator as far as the values go, not the sign, the number itself. So I can switch from an improper fraction to a mixed number by taking 7 divided by 6. 6 goes into 7 one time. Multiply back and subtract. My remainder is a 1. So my final answer then is going to be negative 1 and 1/6. In example 2 here, we're going to add mixed numbers. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to common denominators for my fraction parts. So between 5 and 11, they're relatively prime. So I multiply them together, and that's my common denominator, my least common multiple. So to go from 5 to 55, I multiply by 11, which means I have to multiply the 2 by 11 as well, and I get 22 over 55. To go from 11 to 55, I'm going to multiply by 5. If I change my denominator, I have to change my numerator as well. Here, I'm going to bring down my coefficients, my whole number parts. Sorry, not coefficients, my whole number parts. And now I can add my whole numbers together, and I can add my fractions together. Since I have a common denominator with my fractions, I can go ahead and add my number parts. Numerators, 22 plus 30 is 52. So here I have 52 over 50. And negative 4 plus negative 2 is negative 6. So I get negative 6 and 52 over 50. That does not reduce any further. Here we also could have started off by switching our mixed numbers to improper fractions and going from that as well. I would encourage you to change your fractional parts to get a common denominator first. You don't have to either way, but we certainly could have done that as well. Switch them to mixed numbers, divided to get back to switch them from mixed numbers to improper fractions, and then divided at the end to get back to our mixed number. Here, we can either combine our whole numbers and combine our fractions and then put them together, or we can switch to improper fractions and add that way. And since I did the last one by combining my number parts and my fraction parts, here I'm going to use improper fractions. So my common denominator between 9 and 6, we've done that one before, is going to be 18. It's the smallest number that they both multiply to. So, to go from 9 to 18, we multiply by 2, which means I need to multiply my numerator by 2 as well. To go from 6 to 18, we multiply by 3, which means I need to multiply my numerator as well. So, right now, I'm going to have 3 and 10/18 plus 2 and 3/18. Now I'm going to switch these to improper fractions. 18 times 3 plus 10, denominator times whole number plus numerator, which is going to give me 64 over 18, plus 18 times 2 plus 3, which is 39 over 18. Now that I have a common denominator, I can go ahead and keep my denominator and add my numerators. So here, I'm going to get 103 over 18. Because my numerator is bigger, I'm going to go ahead and divide. So 103 divided by 18. 18 goes in there 5 times, which is 90. When I subtract, I get a remainder of 13. So when I divide, that becomes my whole number. My remainder is my numerator over my denominator is what I divided by, and I get 5 and 13 over 18. 13 and 18 are relatively prime, so I cannot reduce that any further. I will stop here and finish in another video.